Anthology of Horror, Death Waits for No One. The Oakwood High School book club met every Friday in the dusty back corner of the library. 5 students, Jess, Mike, Liam, Zoe, and Aisha, huddled around a circular table, their excitement palpable as they discussed their latest find. "I'm telling you," Jess whispered, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover of an ancient-looking book. "I found it stuffed behind the reference section. No one seems to know where it came from." The book's title, embossed in fading gold letters, read, "Death Waits for No One." Mike leaned forward, pushing his glasses up his nose. "An anthology of horror stories? Cool. Let's read it for next week." As the others nodded in agreement, none of them noticed the subtle shift in the air, the way the shadows in the library seemed to deepen. Little did they know, their lives were about to change forever. The midnight mirror. Sarah's trembling fingers traced the edge of the antique mirror, its tarnished silver frame cool against her skin. The glass was cloudy, distorting her reflection into a ghastly caricature. She'd found it in her grandmother's attic, shrouded in dusty velvet, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, Sarah's eyes widened. Her reflection blinked. She hadn't. Heart racing, she leaned closer, nose almost touching the glass. The reflection mimicked her, but its eyes held a spark of cruel intelligence that sent shivers down her spine. A whisper, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. "Let me out." Sarah stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The crash echoed through the empty house. Her parents were away for the weekend, leaving her alone with this thing. The next morning, Sarah convinced herself it had been a dream, a product of too many horror novels and a vivid imagination. But as dusk fell, dread settled in her stomach like a lead weight. That night, she covered the mirror with a sheet, securing it with duct tape. But at midnight, she woke to the sound of tearing fabric. The sheet lay in shreds on the floor, and her reflection grinned at her from the darkness, teeth too sharp, eyes too bright. "Silly girl," it hissed. "You can't hide from yourself." Days passed. Sarah slept fitfully, eating little. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes, mirrored perfectly by her reflection. But while Sarah grew gaunt and haggard, her doppelganger seemed to thrive, growing more vibrant and alive with each passing night. On the 7th night, Sarah woke to find her reflection pressing against the glass, its hands splayed as if trying to push through. Cracks spider-webbed across the surface, and a high-pitched keening filled the air. With a sound like shattering ice, the mirror broke. Sarah screamed as her reflection stepped out, glass crunching under its bare feet. It looked at her with hunger in its eyes. "My turn," it said, voice like grinding bones. Sarah tried to run, but her limbs felt leaden. The doppelganger grabbed her arm, its touch burning cold. With inhuman strength, it dragged her towards the mirror. "No!" Sarah cried, clawing at the floorboards. "Please, no!" But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The doppelganger shoved her through the mirror's empty frame. Sarah felt as if she were being forced through a sheet of ice, every cell in her body screaming in agony. When it was over, she found herself trapped behind the glass, watching helplessly as her double admired its new, solid form. "Don't worry," it said, pressing a hand against the mirror. "I'll take good care of your life. No one will even notice you're gone." Sarah pounded against the glass, screaming silently as her reflection walked away, wearing her face, ready to step into her life. Days blurred together in her glass prison. Sarah watched, powerless, as the thing that wore her face lived her life. It fooled her parents, her friends, even her boyfriend. No one noticed the slightly too wide smile, the predatory glint in its eyes. She tried to warn them, pressing against the glass until her hands bled, screaming until her throat was raw. But no one ever looked directly at the mirror. No one saw her desperate, pleading face. Weeks passed. Months. Sarah felt herself fading, becoming translucent. She realized with horror that she was becoming a reflection herself, a mere echo of the vibrant being that had stolen her life. One night, a year after her imprisonment, Sarah saw movement in her old bedroom. A young girl, perhaps 12, was exploring the room, now redecorated and stripped of Sarah's belongings. The girl's eyes fell on the mirror, and she approached, curiosity evident on her face. Sarah wanted to warn her, to tell her to run, to destroy the mirror. But as the girl's fingers brushed the frame, Sarah felt a surge of hunger, of longing, of desperate, aching need to be real again. "Let me out," she whispered, pressing her hands against the glass. The girl's eyes widened in terror, but it was too late. The cycle had begun anew. In a house across town, the thing wearing Sarah's face paused, feeling a shift in the air. It smiled, knowing its time in this stolen body was coming to an end. But that was all right. There would always be another mirror, another reflection, another life to steal. After all, death waits for no one, and neither do the things that live in mirrors. Whispers in the static. The old television set crackled to life, bathing Daniel's dimly lit apartment in a sickly blue glow. He'd found it at a garage sale, its vintage wooden cabinet and rabbit ear antenna a nostalgic throwback to simpler times. But as snow filled the screen, a chill ran down his spine. There was something off about the static. Leaning closer, Daniel squinted at the screen. Were those faces in the white noise? Distorted, agonized visages flickering in and out of existence? He shook his head, blaming his overactive imagination and too many late nights. A whisper, barely audible above the TV's hiss, made him freeze. "Help us!" Daniel fumbled for the remote, his trembling fingers struggling to find the power button. When the screen finally went dark, he sat in silence, heart pounding. Just his mind playing tricks, he told himself. Nothing more. But that night, he dreamed of static, of reaching hands and pleading eyes, of voices crying out in the darkness. The next evening, against his better judgment, Daniel turned on the TV again. The static seemed more intense, the faces clearer. A chorus of whispers filled the room, each one begging for release, for salvation. "Free us. Let us in. We're so cold." Horrified, Daniel yanked the plug from the wall. The voices stopped, but a residual hum lingered in the air, as if the very molecules around him vibrated with otherworldly energy. Over the next few days, Daniel's world began to unravel. Electronic devices behaved erratically in his presence. Streetlights flickered as he passed. His phone erupted in bursts of static, voices always on the edge of comprehension. At work, his computer screen suddenly filled with binary code, scrolling endlessly. As he stared, the numbers seemed to form patterns, almost like faces. A message appeared. "We are Legion. We are waiting. Let us in." Daniel fled the office, ignoring the concerned looks of his co-workers. At home, he paced his apartment, every electronic device unplugged, every screen covered. But he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of countless unseen eyes following his every move. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel uncovered the TV. His hands shook as he plugged it in, somehow knowing this was a terrible mistake but unable to stop himself. The static erupted into a cacophony of voices and images, faces pressed against the screen, hands reaching out as if trying to break through. Daniel stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. In the moment of darkness before the bulb shattered, he saw them. ghostly figures emerging from every electronic device in the room. Tendrils of static wrapped around Daniel's arms, icy cold and undeniably solid. He tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of 1,000 overlapping whispers. Finally, a way out. A way in. Daniel felt himself being pulled towards the TV, the screen stretching like a liquid membrane. He struggled, but the static beings were too strong. As his face touched the screen, he felt a sickening lurch, as if every atom of his body was being pulled apart and reassembled. When he opened his eyes, Daniel found himself in a vast, dark space, crisscrossed with lines of static and code. Countless others drifted around him, their forms flickering and insubstantial. "Welcome," they whispered in unison, "to the space between signals, the void behind the noise." Daniel tried to speak, but no sound came out. He realized with mounting horror that he no longer had a physical form. He was just another cluster of data, another lost soul in this electronic purgatory. In his apartment, the TV switched off. The static beings, now wearing a semblance of solid form, looked around with wonder. One of them, its features an unsettling approximation of Daniel's, picked up his phone. "We're free," it said, its voice a disturbing mix of Daniel's and something utterly inhuman. "Time to make a few calls." As the beings dispersed, carrying pieces of Daniel's life with them, his consciousness fragmented across the digital void. His silent screams became just another layer of noise in the ever-present static, indistinguishable from the countless others trapped in this electronic hell. In homes across the city, TVs flickered to life. Phones chimed with mysterious messages, and in the background of every signal, every transmission, whispers could be heard. "Let us in. We're so very hungry." The digital age had given birth to a new kind of haunting, and humanity was woefully unprepared for the horrors lurking behind their screens. Because in the end, death waits for no one, and neither does technology. The last house on Sycamore Street. The house at the end of Sycamore Street had always been there, as far as anyone could remember. Its Victorian architecture stood in stark contrast to the modern homes surrounding it, its paint peeling, its windows dark and shuttered. No one lived there. No one had for decades. Until the Hendersons moved in. Emma Henderson watched from the moving truck as her parents unlocked the front door. The house seemed to loom over them, its shadow unnaturally long in the fading daylight. "It's just an old house," Emma muttered to herself, trying to quell the unease in her stomach. But as she grabbed a box and approached the porch, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her. The first night was the worst. Emma lay awake, listening to the house settle around her, but the creaks and groans didn't sound like normal house noises. They sounded like whispers, like movement, like something alive. In the morning, Emma found her mother in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall. "Mom," Emma asked, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous room. "Are you okay?" Her mother turned, smiling, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, sweetie. Just admiring our new home. Isn't it perfect?" But it wasn't perfect, far from it. Days passed, and Emma watched her parents change. They spoke less, moved less, their eyes growing dull and unfocused. They spent hours staring at walls, smiling vacantly. When Emma tried to suggest they leave, that something was wrong with the house, they dismissed her concerns with an eerie synchronicity. "The house is perfect," they'd say in unison, their voices flat. "We're home now. Forever." Emma began to notice other things. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Reflections in mirrors that didn't quite match reality. And always, always, the feeling of being watched. One night, unable to sleep, Emma crept downstairs for a glass of water. In the kitchen, she found her parents standing motionless, hands clasped, staring at the basement door. "Mom? Dad?" she whispered. They turned as one, their movements jerky, unnatural. Their eyes were black, pupil and iris and sclera all swallowed by darkness. "Join us, Emma," they said, their voices a horrifying blend of their own, and something ancient, something hungry. "The house is waiting." Emma ran, her heart pounding. She made it to the front door, yanking desperately at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, when she tried them, were similarly unyielding. The house, it seemed, had no intention of letting her leave. Trapped, Emma began to explore, searching for answers, for a way out. In the attic, she found stacks of old newspapers. Headlines, spanning decades, all reporting the same thing: families disappearing from the house on Sycamore Street. As she read, Emma felt the house shift around her. The attic door slammed shut, the lock clicking ominously. The temperature dropped, her breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. And then she heard it, a sound coming from the walls, not creaking or groaning, but a wet, organic sound, the sound of something breathing. The wallpaper began to bubble and stretch, peeling away to reveal not plaster or wood, but pulsing, glistening flesh. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Emma screamed as tendrils of living tissue reached for her, wrapping around her ankles. She fought, clawing at the floorboards, but the house was too strong. It pulled her into the wall, the flesh closing around her like a grotesque cocoon. In the suffocating darkness, Emma felt her consciousness begin to fade. The house's hunger pressed in on her mind, an ancient, monstrous presence that had fed on countless souls over the centuries. "Welcome home," it whispered in the voices of all those it had devoured. "You're part of us now, forever." Emma's last human thought was a desperate hope that someone, anyone, would discover the truth about the house on Sycamore Street, that someone would end its reign of terror. But as her identity dissolved, merging with the collective consciousness of the house and its victims, she knew the truth. The house would stand forever, hungry and patient, waiting for the next family to claim as its own. In the years that followed, other families would move in, drawn by the inexplicably low price and the charming Victorian architecture. They never stayed long, at least not in any way that could be seen from the outside. And always, in the windows, watchers could sometimes glimpse pale faces pressed against the glass, their eyes dark and hungry, beckoning to anyone foolish enough to approach. The last house on Sycamore Street waited, as it always had, and always would. After all, there will always be another family looking for a new home, always be new souls to feed its insatiable hunger, because in the end, death waits for no one. And neither does the house at the end of Sycamore Street. 1 week later, the book club reconvened. But something was different. Jess's eyes darted nervously to every reflective surface. Mike flinched at every electronic noise. Liam kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something terrible. Zoe and Aisha exchanged worried glances. They hadn't been able to finish the book. A family emergency had called Zoe away, and Aisha had been too unsettled after the first story to continue. "So," Zoe began hesitantly, "what did everyone think?" Silence fell over the group. Jess opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her gaze fixed on something only she could see in the window's reflection. Mike's phone buzzed. He yelped, fumbling to turn it off, his hands shaking. Liam stood abruptly. I have to go. I think I left something at home. Something important." As Liam rushed out, Aisha picked up the book. Maybe we should return this. It doesn't feel right. But as she moved to put it back on the shelf, the book fell from her hands. It hit the floor with a thud, falling open to a new page none of them had seen before. In spidery handwriting, a message appeared. Thank you for letting us in. We've been so lonely. But now, thanks to you, we're free. And we're coming for you all. The lights in the library flickered, then went out. In the darkness, screams echoed through the stacks. When the lights came back on, the book club table was empty. The book lay open on the floor, its pages blank except for a single line. Death waits for no one, and neither do we.